Well, good morning. It is cool to be here. It is cool to see all the blue jackets. I think these kids did a really fabulous job last night, so that those of you who were here got to see something cool, and those that you missed it really blew it. What they asked me to talk about this morning was to give you a little bit of an overview of the Wild Horse and Burro Act, and then talk about some of the other statutes that sort of interact with the Wild Horse and Burro Act. The thing you need to keep in mind as you go into your sessions this afternoon is the law lets you go places and the law doesn't let you go places. And so some of your discussion this afternoon needs to be framed with, what can I do statutorily? Because if you suggest something that's outside the statute, the BLM can't do it even if they wanted to. So I think you need to keep kind of this framework in mind as you come up with your recommendations. Now, John really covered the Wild Horse and Burro Act, so I'm not going to go into great detail. Wild Horse and Burro Act was passed in 1971 to protect wild and free-roaming horses on the range. I think initially there was a problem with how wild horses were captured and treated. That's what Wild Horse Annie saw. And her campaign with kids was incredibly successful. The courts have recognized that. In fact, I tease my husband all the time. My husband is from Nevada, and my husband was one of those 7th graders that had to write a letter to Congress, I'm not kidding you, to support passage of the Wild Horse and Burro Act. So a lot of times, as I'm teasing him, I'm telling him it's your fault. But that was a brilliant grassroots strategy, and I think it was necessary at the time. I do all sorts of speeches that are entitled, "What Happens When Good Laws Go Bad?" This is sort of what happened. In 1978, Congress recognized that the Wild Horse Act was working too well in protecting wild horses. Because we were getting an overpopulation of horses, Congress passed the Public Rangelands Improvement Act, which did all sorts of things, including requiring that wild horses be managed, and the act specifically, according to Wild Horse Protection Association versus Watt, was to strike a balance between protecting wild horses and the competing interests on the range. So according to the courts interpreting the Public Rangelands Improvement Act, it was to bring the multiple use concept back to BLM, so the wild horses was managed as one of the multiple uses, not to be protected higher than grazing or mining or oil and gas or recreation, not to be ignored, but to be one of the equal balanced uses. If you look at the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, that says that public lands are to be managed for multiple use. Multiple use is defined by FLTMA as the major uses including grazing, recreation, timber, mining, wildlife, and the other multiple uses. Now, not every acre of land has to be managed for every acre, for every use. And we all understand that. But as part of that multiple use mandate, Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act also talks about sustained yield. And what that means is protecting the resource so that it can be managed in perpetuity. And I look at those pictures yesterday that they show, and I wonder if we're really protecting the resource. Because when you have beat out water holes and overgrazing, that's truly not resource protection. Now, as part of management, we heard talk yesterday about AML. AML is set in a public document, and the BLM didn't just pick numbers out of thin air. When the BLM sets those AMLs, they actually look at the range and the forage and the multiple use, and they try to figure out what the appropriate number of horses is to be balanced with all of the other multiple uses out there. So this is not just some magic number that BLM pulled out of thin air. They actually did it with some scientific multiple use thought in mind. Now, what the Act requires BLM to do is that if you get horses over AML, the Act says that excess horses cannot be removed unless there is a decision and there is range degradation. Now, I was in a federal court case earlier this year, and the court strongly stated that there is a difference between overpopulation, which is over AML, and excess. And excess is what's required to remove wild horses. The BLM makes what they call an excess determination. That is a separate decision document accompanied by NEPA compliance that finds that there are deteriorating resources on the range. Now, the state of Wyoming tried to bring a case, I guess this is 2017, so it would have been in 2016. And one of the things that they wanted to argue was that an overpopulation should be enough to trigger an excess determination for removal of horses from the range. And the 10th Circuit Court rejected that determination. The 10th Circuit Court recognized you have to have these excess determinations. And so the BLM has to go through that second analysis and actually look at range condition as well as horse population numbers before that can trigger a decision to remove. Now, once the excess determination is made, the statute says that the BLM shall immediately remove excess horses from the range. Now, immediate doesn't say 10 days or 60 days or 120 days. And there is great debate between the BLM and the livestock industry, for example, on what immediate means. I brought a federal district court case in the District of Utah for 16 ranchers, and we got a decision earlier this year. And one of the things that the federal district judge in that case said is she said immediate has to mean something. In that case, the Justice Department tried to argue that immediate meant 6 to 10 years. I'm not kidding you. And at oral argument, the BLM tried to argue that it had to mean that long because they don't have any space in the holding facilities. They don't have any money for gathers. And because of budget and space, and because they have to balance the Utah wild horses with the Nevada wild horse problem and the Wyoming wild horse problem and everybody else's wild horse problem, that in their view, 6 to 10 years was, quote, immediate. The judge clearly in the Utah case rejected that notion. She said, I don't know what immediate is, but 6 to 10 years is not immediate. Unfortunately for us, she didn't actually give it a time frame. She didn't say what she thought it was, but she said 6 to 10 years is not. Now, as another part of the Wild Horse and Burro Act is what happens on private land. And on private land, private landowners are absolutely prohibited from moving wild horses off of their private land. You can go to jail for that, so don't do it. And what the courts have looked at in that is, number one, they recognize that the statute says that the BLM has to move wild horses off of private land. And what we tried to argue, as well as what was argued in what we call the Rock Springs Grazing Association case, which was another case that came down in 2016 out of the 10th Circuit, and we said that moving horses off of private land is simply not like shooing them onto public land, because the horses just come right back. I think one of the scientists yesterday talked about how horses get habituated to wherever they're at. I think that is a correct assumption, and I know there's a lady here, there you are, that is a horse behavioralist, and I mean, I think horses are gonna be like anything else. You're gonna go where there's good food and good water. And so we tried to argue in our case that removing horses from private land couldn't just be you ran them over the next hill. You actually had to remove. And the court in both the Rock Springs Grazing Association and in our case disagreed with that assumption. In fact, the Rock Springs Grazing Association case, they were very clear that in that case, that's a checkerboard land case. And you know, the checkerboards are set up, they were every other section by the railroad. I don't know if the kids understand that, but it really, when you look at the land pattern on the ground, it's like a checkerboard. And every other section is public land and private land. But fencing that private land would be massively expensive and nearly impossible to do. And then you'd have all these little checkerboards of public land that would also be fenced. So in reality, people that own checkerboard land rarely fence because of the expense and because it would just screw up land management like you can't believe. But the court in the Rock Springs Grazing Association case basically said that even though those private landowners have the right not to have wild horses on their private land if they don't want to, we are not going to make the BLM gather the horses to keep them off the private land. And so the whole idea that BLM can just go, chase the horses off of the private land, even though they're going to come right back, is still valid under the court interpretation. So you've got the act and you've got the courts interpreting it, but you've got limitations on the act. The original act allowed the unprohibited sale of wild horses to whoever wanted to buy the things. And what you had with that unlimited sale authority is you had certain people going out and they'd buy a whole bunch of wild horses at not very much money. They'd put them on private land. They'd feed them until they were fat, and then they would haul them to Mexico or send them to slaughter or do whatever in the heck they wanted to do. And the public found that unacceptable. And so they put a rider to stop the BLM from having this unlimited sale authority. And that's where you come up with the idea that BLM can only sell, was it 3 horses or 4 horses at a time? When they sell the horses, you have to promise as the buyer that you're not going to sell them, that if you're going to transfer them, you've got to jump through certain hoops. But that sale rider that limited the sale authority came because of public outcry over what was happening to the wild horses. Once that rider was put on and the horse population started to expand again, you had a guy named Conrad Burns out of Oregon put a second rider on the act that talked about humanely euthanizing horses after they'd been tried to adopt them out 3 times. And the Burns Amendment was really to try, again, to deal with this wild horse overpopulation. Because we'd learned, as we learned yesterday, these wild horses don't have any natural predators and they breed like rabbits. And so the Burns Amendment was to try to limit the amount of holdings. That was in 2004. In 2007, there was another rider put on the act that said that BLM cannot fund euthanasia for wild horses. And so it's not that BLM doesn't have the legal authority to be able to euthanize horses after they try to adopt them out 3 times. It's that Congress prohibited them from spending any money on euthanizing horses. Now, you have had people try to get around that funding idea in other examples, not in the wild horse example, but you have had then private owners in other situations when Congress cuts the funding for something saying, well, we'll pay for the inspectors. We will pay for the euthanization. That's been shut down by the courts. So although nobody has done it in this situation, I think if you had a private person go out to BLM and say, we would fund this program because you got the legal authority to do it, and we would try to put up the funds to do it, I do not think that that would pass muster of the courts. Now, the Wild Horse and Burro Act doesn't carry with it, ooh, I better get faster, a cause of action. So you can't sue under the Wild Horse and Burro Act. So the way these environmental groups and the wild horse activist groups or anybody else gets into court is suing over the NEPA documents. As I told you, the NEPA documents are required when the BLM makes an excess determination or determines that it's going to gather these horses. NEPA is a procedural statute. The courts have said 100 times that NEPA does not dictate an outcome. It merely forces the federal agencies to consider all environmental consequences. The problem that getting through these NEPA documents is complicated, and it is easy to make a mistake. And there's not a federal agency out there that has figured out how to do these NEPA documents to survive court challenge. I am not blaming the BLM. I am really complaining that the courts have made NEPA compliance nearly impossible. And so what these groups can do is they can come in and they can stop a gather, or they can stop an excess determination simply because the agency just can't they either don't consider the environmental actions enough, or they don't look at all the alternatives, or some other procedural excuse to stop these documents. So one of the things that you may want to think about this afternoon is, are there ways that we can deal with the NEPA compliance part, not just with looking at the Wild Horse and Burro Act? The other thing I want to mention real quick, and this is kind of for the BLM people in the room, is that one of the things that the federal district court raised in the oral argument that I was in last year is she was hammering on the Justice Department attorney about BLM is stuck between a rock and a hard place. They don't have any money to gather the horses. They don't have any place to put the horses, but the act says shall immediately gather. And she was asking this attorney, what are you guys going to do? You can't comply with the law. And he said, yeah, we can't comply with the law. And she said, have you ever been to Congress to try to fix the problem? And this Justice Department attorney said, that's the ranchers' problem. They got to go to Congress to fix this problem. So that got me thinking about, what does the BLM or any other federal agency have the legal authority to do when it comes to going to Congress? And so I looked up the Anti-Lobbying Act, and then I looked up the Justice Department opinions about how that act applies to federal agencies. Because I've had Congress tell me this before. If you want to go to Congress, the only thing you can do is sit there politely and we can ask you questions if you're a federal agency. Actually, what the Justice Department says about lobbying is that the only thing federal agencies are prohibited from doing is to start grassroots campaigns. But federal agencies absolutely have the legal authority to go to Congress and say, help us fix this problem. We can't comply with the act. You have stuck us between a rock and a hard place. Congress needs to help us. So it's not just we're presenting information to ask a question. I think BLM and the Forest Service needs to specifically take this and go with these ranchers and wild horse advocates and the people in this audience or wherever and actually talk to Congress about this problem. So I did really good and I ended on time. I will turn it over to the next speaker and then I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have. Thank you.